My name is Anouar Majid. I'm the director of the Center for Global Humanities. And tonight we have the great pleasure of presenting an exceptional lecture, which was not, if you look at the program, it was not initially programmed, but the book just came out, and it's an occasion that we couldn't miss. And it's the book, as you could see on the screen, The Accusation, Blood Libel in an American Town, by Ed Berenson, who is no stranger to the Center for Global Humanities and the Tangier Global Forum and in Tangier. And so tonight he will be talking about a very interesting and exciting topic, recently reviewed in all the major newspapers and other publications, the New York Times, Wall Street Journal. And Ed is a professor and chair of the history department at NYU, just assumed that role this year. He is a cultural historian specializing in the history of modern France and its empire, with additional interest in the history of Britain, the British Empire, and the United States. He's the author most recently of The Statue of Liberty, A Transatlantic Story, Europe in the Modern World, and The Accusation, which is now on the screen. Berenson has won distinguished teaching awards from UCLA and the American Historical Association, and in 2006 was decorated by the French government as Chevalier dans l'Ordre du Mérite. Please help me welcome Ed to the podium.
Thank you, Anouar. Thanks everyone for coming. It's really wonderful to be back here. I think I was here just about 2 years ago, and this time, like last time, it's really been a wonderful experience. I tend not to like to stand behind a podium, but I'm told that I'm supposed to do that, so I'm gonna stay put. I wanted to begin by just reading the first couple of pages from the book, just to set the scene. On Saturday, September 22nd, 1928, 4-year-old Barbara Griffiths strayed into the woods surrounding Messina, New York, an upstate village overlooking the broad St. Lawrence River. Barbara's mother had sent her to look for her older brother, Bobby, who was playing in the woods. At 6 p.m., Bobby came home for dinner, as he always did, but without his sister in tow. Alarmed, the children's father, Dave, told Bobby and his gang to fan out around the town while he headed into the woods. When Dave failed to locate his daughter, he alerted the Messina police, whose chief sounded the fire alarm to summon the town's volunteer firefighters to the Griffiths house. From there, the uniformed men organized a massive search for the missing girl. By 7 p.m., some 300 people in a town of about 10,000 were combing through dozens of homes and ranging deep into the forest. The hunt for the missing child continued through the night and into the following day. To no avail. By mid-afternoon on Sunday, Barbara still had not been found. Her parents were frantic and the townspeople on edge. Everyone knew Barbara, who was an adorable post-toddler and wise beyond her years. The picture, taken shortly before Barbara's disappearance, shows her with a page boy hair and a pensive smile. She stands at right angles to the camera, but her head slightly bows, faces the photographer boldly. She's neatly but not fancily dressed, with loose leggings, a dress floating just above her knees, and a short double-breasted coat. Most adults would have found her precious, and that's why so many had jumped so readily into the effort to find her. Had Barbara fallen on her head? Had she been attacked by animals, by the large members of the large indigenous population who lived there, by an escaped criminal, or had something more diabolical taken place? Several hours into the search, someone, it's unclear who, floated the idea that Barbara had been kidnapped and killed by the Jews. She was the victim, voices said, of ritual murder, of the Jews' supposed need to ritually kill Christian children and harvest their blood. This is the only known case of the ritual murder accusation against Jews in American history. It was, sadly, all too common in Europe, and I'll be talking a bit about that European history in a few minutes. I got interested in this story partly because of its uniqueness. Why was it that this is something common in Europe, unknown in the United States, and then suddenly it surfaced in this little upstate New York town in 1928? But the main reason I got interested in this story is because I'm from this town. I was born in Messina, New York, as was my father. My father grew up there, and I spent the first 3 years or so of my life in Messina, returning there every summer because my father's entire family continued to live up there. And so I have a pretty deep personal connection with this story. And so here is a shot of my great-grandparents, Ida and Jesse Kaufman, with, and this is kind of weird for me to say because that's my grandmother on their lap. And my grandmother lived until age 100, and so I remember her mainly as an elderly person, so to see her as a baby is really quite startling. And we think that Ida and Jesse Kaufman, my great-grandparents, were the first Jewish residents of Messina, New York. And like so many Jews at that time, they had come from Eastern Europe, that my great-grandparents came relatively early in the 1880s, and my great-grandfather Jesse, like so many young Jewish men who landed in New York, he became a peddler, and he peddled his wares up north toward Albany, following along the Erie Canal. The Erie Canal bends to the left, and then when he got to the end, he headed straight up north, and he bumped into the St. Lawrence River, and decided to move over a little bit to the town of Messina, which is just slightly to the east. And here's a shot of the store they opened, Kaufman's department store. This is a shot from 1908, and you'll notice that the roads aren't even paved yet. And that store lasted until the 1980s, when it was finally torn down, when there was no one left in the family to run it. Now, what attracted Ida and Jesse Kaufman to Messina was the building in 1902 of a huge aluminum smelting plant, Alcoa. Alcoa came to Messina because of the hydroelectric power from the St. Lawrence River. And so suddenly, this little town perched on the northern edge of New York State, an hour and change from Montreal, a place that had been totally rural, white, and Protestant, suddenly it undergoes an industrial transformation, and this little town becomes a kind of microcosm for the United States in this time, the industrializing the United States. Alcoa needed quickly to hire a huge number of workers. And so recruiters from Alcoa went right to Ellis Island, and they recruited people off the boat. They also recruited people coming across the border from Quebec. And then the US-Canadian border was meaningless. You could live on one side and work on the other. You could go back and forth. No one looked at you twice. And so a large part of the workforce from Alcoa was immigrant laborers from Europe, mostly from Eastern Europe. I'll come back to this because this is an important part of the story, and also from Quebec. Now, because of Alcoa, Messina became a pretty prosperous town. And here's a shot from 1928, and you see kind of solid brick buildings and cars from the era. It was a place that took off industrially and economically, and this is what attracted more immigrants to the town including a certain number of Jewish immigrants. And so by 1928, there were about 25 Jewish families, around 100 Jewish people living in this town. And the Jews, as they were in so many in small towns, mostly shopkeepers, mostly store owners. Now, this guy was the mayor of the town, W. Gilbert Hawes, and here's another sort of weird personal connection. I live in Tarrytown, New York, which is just north of New York City, and this is where this guy was originally from, and he made his way up to northern New York, became the mayor of this town, and he presided over the transformation of this once rural agricultural town into a bustling industrial community. But there's a downside here, because the mayor, when he got wind of the rumor that started to fly during the night of December 22nd to December 23rd, when he got wind of the rumor that the Jews had kidnapped Barbara, he got together with the police chief, and they decided that they needed to investigate this. And so the following morning, it was actually more like midday, the mayor and the police chief summoned the rabbi, a man named Beryl Brennglass, summoned Rabbi Brennglass to the police station and interrogated him. And the first question they asked him was, Rabbi, do we have a Jewish holiday coming up? And it turned out that it was the eve of Yom Kippur. Second question, do your people conduct human sacrifices on a Jewish holiday? The rabbi was shocked. He was speechless. He and so many other Jews had come to the United States precisely to escape these kinds of accusations, and here he was confronted with the question, do your people conduct human sacrifices on a Jewish holiday? And so indignantly, the rabbi said that, I can't believe you're asking me this question. This is the United States of America. You should be ashamed of yourself. And the rabbi stalked out of the police station. And when he left the station, there was a crowd of about 300 people standing outside, and there are different reports about the temper of the crowd, but one of the reports said the crowd was fairly hostile. And he had to wade across the crowd to get to the synagogue where members of his congregation had gathered. And they had gathered partly because it was the eve of Yom Kippur, but they had also gathered because of this rumor that was flying around. They were scared. They were worried. I interviewed a woman named Alice Rosen, who was 102 years old at the time I interviewed her. She was 16 when this happened, and she said when this rumor started to fly, the Jews of Messina, New York thought there was going to be a pogrom. Why? Because so many had come from places where there had been pogroms, and that's one of the main reasons why they left those places to come to the United States. So, understandingly, not surprisingly, the Jews of this little town were worried, and the president of the congregation, though there's a shot of Rabbi Brennglass, and I learned a lot about him because his grandson lives close by to me in New Rochelle, and he had a lot of memories about this story. And so the president of the Messina congregation got on the telephone and called this man, Louis Marshall, who was the president of the main Jewish organization at the time, the American Jewish Committee. And the Messina synagogue president said, we need your advice. What should we do about this? We're scared. We don't know what's going on. And Marshall said, I'm going to get right on this. I'm going to dispatch somebody to come up. And in fact, Louis Marshall, for reasons unknown, didn't act all that quickly. And so the Jewish leaders of Messina also got in touch with this man, Rabbi Stephen Wise, who was the head of the other main Jewish organization, the American Jewish Congress. And little did the Jewish leaders of Messina, New York know that these two guys were rivals. they despised each other. And so the Jews of Messina got themselves embroiled in a kind of political rivalry between these two important, powerful, charismatic leaders of the American Jewish community. And what both Rabbi Wise and Louis Marshall decided that they needed to do was to make a lesson of this accusation, to publicize it around the country so that the American people would understand that this legend is false, it has always been false, it is a libel against the Jewish people, and that Americans needed to know what a terrible role that this accusation had played in the history of anti-Semitism. So let's go back almost a millennium to the origin of the blood libel. What is this accusation? So before tonight, or if you read a review of my book or anything, how many of you have heard of the blood libel? Okay, that's a fair number. It's actually fairly common for me to talk to people, including Jewish people, who've never heard of it. If you are a European Jew, you could not fail to have heard of it. And so the first known case of the ritual murder accusation against Jews came in the middle of the 12th century, 1147 to be exact, in England. And it was spread around by a monk named Thomas of Monmouth. And Thomas wrote a book about this, which you can still buy. This book is a Penguin classic. And it's the life and passion of William of Norwich. William is the young boy who was said to have been crucified by the Jews. And here's a passage from Thomas of Monmouth's book. He said, "The Jews of Norwich brought a Christian child before Easter and tortured him with all the torture that our Lord was tortured with, and on Good Friday hanged him on a cross." Now, of course, no one saw this happen. A little boy did turn up dead. There was no evidence whatsoever that the Jews of Norwich had anything to do with this. No one had seen any foul play. And so an awful lot of people did not believe this story until in 1850, some travelers who were passing through Norwich, England, experienced some miracles, some miracle healing. And this is when Thomas of Monmouth said, aha, you see, I'm right, that this little boy, William, is a martyr. He was martyred by the Jews, and he is producing miracles because the Jews have turned him into a saint of the church. And so this is how the legend spread of William of Norwich, the first victim of the supposed Jewish ritual murder. And because the monks traveled around and there were merchants who traveled around, this legend spread, and it spread throughout England, and it spread back to the English, into the European continent. The next really big accusation against the Jews was the so-called Little Saint Hugh of Lincoln. This back again on the British continent, and the iconography of these blood libels became really a really important part both of Catholic art and of secular forms of art. And so what you see here is a painting from the mid-18th century depicting the supposed ritual murder of Little Saint Hugh in the middle of the 13th century. And I'm going to see if I can spotlight this for you. And you see that these are really graphic images. And so here there are three Jewish men here who are stuffing a baby into a barrel. You see the legs of the baby. The barrel has spikes coming out of it. And so the baby in this legend is stuffed alive into the barrel. And you see, here's another Jewish man who is collecting the blood in a vessel. Now, these are graphic. Can you see this with the spotlight? So these guys are stuffing the child into the barrel. this man collecting the blood. These images were repeated again and again in the centuries that follow, and this legend showed up famously, infamously, in one of Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, the Prioris's Tale. And when I read the Canterbury Tales in my freshman English course, they didn't assign this one. But in this tale repeats the legend of Jewish ritual murder. Now, in the late Middle Ages, this is probably the most prominent one, the most prominent example of the idea of Jewish ritual murder. It took place in Trent, which is now part of northern Italy. Then it was in the Holy Roman Empire, was a Germanic political organization, and a little boy named Simon, his body turned up. Somebody had killed him. The Jews of the town were accused of doing the deed, and we know a lot about this because the doctor who examined the dead child wrote an elaborate narrative of this story, and especially of the trial that the Jews who were accused of this murder underwent. And so we're now into the Renaissance. In the medieval period, when an accusation was leveled, there were no trials. Usually there was revenge against the Jews who were said to have done this. There were violent acts committed against them, property destroyed. When you get to the late 15th century, now the idea is that you have to put the Jews on trial. But it wasn't the kind of trial that we're familiar with, because the trial was done via judicial torture. And that is, people who were accused of crimes were tortured until they confessed to a narrative that the judges had constructed in advance. That narrative was based on the earlier legends of ritual murder that had come down starting in the 12th century. But here's a line from the book that Tiberino, the doctor who examined the trial, the child and who had followed the trial, here's what he said. He said, quote, "The Jews, raising their weapons, sank them hard in the reclining sacred body. Like Jesus, Simon lowered his head as he gave up his Holy Spirit to the Lord." And so the idea was that the Jews enacted the crucifixion of Christ through the capture and torture and the draining of the blood of Christian children. Now, there was a huge amount of iconography that surfaced around this trial, and you can still see these frescoes and paintings in the churches of Trent, Italy. And so the one on your left is the Church of St. Anna Maria Annunziata in Bieno, Italy, and you can see again a graphic rendering of a child, a living child, being pierced and the blood drained. Here's another one on the other side. It's entitled "The Martyrdom of the Blessed Simon of Trent," and you see this in Brescia, Italy. You can still see these images, and Simon became a saint of the Catholic Church, and he remained a saint of the Catholic Church until Vatican II in the 1960s, when the Pope decreed that these legends were false, that Catholics should not believe them, and that the iconography that supported them should come down. But because there were all these pictures, all these graphic drawings, here's another one. Here is a medallion on the facade of one of the great palaces in Trent. These images produced memories that sank into people's consciousness and were reinforced every time people saw these images. And so even if a stretch of time would pass without there being a ritual murder allegation against Jews, the idea that Jews did this was reinforced, every time you saw one of these images. And so in a way, that the notion that Jews must ritually murder children for their religious needs sunk in deeply into a European, and especially a European Catholic, consciousness. And that consciousness was reinforced again and again by the persistence of these iconographic images. Now, with the Protestant Reformation, the number of ritual murder accusations subsided, and they were replaced by a witch craze. The people who were persecuted during the 1600s and into the 1700s tended to be women who were accused of being Jews. But in the 18th century, and especially the 19th century, the ritual murder accusation, the blood libel against Jews, roared back into prominence. Yet another graphic illustration, and here is in the late 19th century, when there was an explosion of new ritual murder accusations. The most notorious one happened in a little town in Hungary called Tiszalár, 1882, 1883, and you see the drawing of Esther Solmozi, who it was said the Jews had murdered and killed for her blood. There was a kind of inconvenient thing in this case, and that is that the body of Esther never turned up. She disappeared, but there was no evidence that anyone had been killed, no evidence of any sort of foul play at all. No matter, the Jews of this town were accused of having murdered her for ritual purposes anyway. So why did this allegation against Jews surface so prominently in the late 19th century? People who've studied this period in detail have cataloged about 100 accusations of ritual murder against Jews between 1880 and the First World War. Why so many? Well, this was a time of enormous change. This was the era, the first era of globalization. This was a time when liberal and socialistic ideologies were taking over, when farmers and small shopkeepers were having a really hard time competing because of the growth of huge industries and huge banks, and people were suffering. This was the era of the Long Depression, what economic historians call the Long Depression of the 19th century, that lasted from the mid-70s to the mid-90s. Someone needed to be blamed, and the Jews, who were prominent in certain banking circles and in certain industrial circles, and the Jews who peddled on the streets and who were said to have deprived shopkeepers, of Christian shopkeepers, of their livelihoods, they were blamed for the economic dislocation and the political changes, the rapid demographic and sociological changes of the time. Jews found themselves being blamed, and they were the objects of one of the most sort of scurrilous anti-Jewish pieces of writing of the period, a book by the French journalist Edward Berenson. The French title is La France Juive, and a good way to translate that would be France taken over by the Jews. And here's what Berenson wrote in this book, La France Juive. He said, the Jews were characterized, quote, by their famous hooked noses, blinking eyes, a clenched jaw, protuberant ears, square nails, flat feet, round knees, and a soft and flabby hand of the hypocrite and the traitor. What's beginning to happen is Jews are being racialized in Europe and seen not just as a religious group, but as a separate racial category. And so you begin then to see a wave of accusations of ritual murder against Jews that start in Hungary and are repeated throughout Germany and Poland, Hungary, Italy, what's now the Czech Republic, and so on, one after the other, after the other, after the other. Now, so by the end of the 19th century and into the early 20th century, there was a famous case of the ritual murder accusation in Russia that took place in 1913. And so the question is, and this is one of the questions that animated the research I did for this book, is how did this phenomenon, which until then had been an entirely European phenomenon, how did it get to the United States? How did it show up in this little town in upstate New York, Messina, New York, where I'm from? And it's especially puzzling because there was a terrible anti-Semitic incident in Atlanta in 1913, a case where a Jewish factory superintendent, a man named Leo Frank, who had moved from New York City to Atlanta to take over the management of a pencil factory, he was accused of having killed a 13-year-old girl. And although there were terrible anti-Semitic overtones to this incident, the ritual murder accusation never came up. Why then did it surface at the end of the 1920s? And so I have a series of hypotheses about this that I think add up to what I hope people will think is a plausible circumstantial case. The first hypothesis has to do with immigration, as I mentioned toward the beginning of the talk. To staff Alcoa, you needed workers. Where did you get those workers? You went down to Ellis Island. Where did a large percentage of the workers who landed at Ellis Island come from? They came from precisely the places in Europe where in the late 19th century the blood libel had become common. In a way, they brought this notion that Jews kill Christian children for their ritual needs, they brought that with them in their baggage. And when they settled in this little town, it came with them. But of course, there were immigrants from these places all over. So that alone doesn't quite answer the question of why it surfaced in Messina, New York. So there's another piece to the puzzle, and that is the immigration from French-speaking Canada. Huge numbers of people crossed the border to take advantage of the jobs that were offered in Alcoa. And Messina, as I said, it's about 80, 90 miles from Messina. When you drive up to that part of New York State and you turn on your car radio, the main stations you hear are in French. So it's right there. It's right on the border with Canada. And it turns out that in 1913, there was a really terrible case in Quebec City of the ritual murder accusation against Jews. And the main sort of proponent of this notion was a man named Edward Plamondon, who was a disciple of this French guy I mentioned a couple of minutes ago, Edouard Drumont, who was the author of that book, France Taken Over by the Jews. And here is one of the characteristic quotes from this French-Canadian guy, Plamondon. He said, "The Jew," I'm quoting him, "is a thief of our property, a corrupter of our women, and the murderer of Christian children." The murderer of Christian children. The Jew, he added, threatened the purity and the sacredness of Quebec's rural way of life. A shot again of how close you are. Here's Montreal, there's Quebec. The big arrow there points to Messina. So you see how close these things are geographically, and this right here is already Quebec. People moved across the border. In Montreal in the 1920s, there surfaced two newspapers that were explicitly dedicated to pushing the idea that the Jews committed terrible crimes. These were explicitly anti-Semitic newspapers, and those of you who can read some French will see the big headline, "Jews are drinkers of blood." And this was a paper that came out right around 1930 in Quebec, in Montreal, but this paper had started earlier than that. And I love the juxtaposition there. The headline right above that is about a hockey game, right? The Canadians crush Montreal 6-1. So you've got the small headline about a hockey game, and right underneath it is the Jews are the drinkers of blood, and then you have these sort of characteristic anti-Semitic images of the Jews who supposedly drink that blood. And so right there on the border next to Messina is a hotbed of hostility to Jews. So then these two factors then start to, I think, give us some pretty good evidence. The combination of immigration from parts of Eastern Europe where the blood libel was common, and immigration from Canada where you have these not just anti-Semitic newspapers and anti-Semitic speech makers, but you also actually have movements in the street dedicated to ejecting the Jews from Quebec City and Montreal. So another important piece of the puzzle. A third one is the revival in the 1920s of the Ku Klux Klan. By 1924, the Klan had 4 million members nationwide. One of the big centers of Klan activity in the United States in the 1920s was in upstate rural New York. And we know from newspaper articles and from eyewitness accounts that there was a cross burning right behind my grandparents' store. Right behind Kaufman's department store, there was a cross burning. And one of the main people in the synagogue in Messina actually attended with his son a Klan meeting because he just wanted to see what that was like, and he was utterly horrified by what he saw. He wrote a letter to one of his friends, and that letter has survived, and I've been able to read that letter. And then in looking at newspapers from the region, there was one Klan meeting after the other throughout the 1920s, but especially as you get close to this incident in 1928, one Klan meeting after the other. You can see how mainstream the Klan is. Here's the little kid wearing the hat and sheets. Cross burning. This guy, you've heard of him. Henry Ford published the only explicitly anti-Semitic newspaper in American history. When did he publish that newspaper? In the 1920s. And the headline of each of the articles, which ran weekly for over the space of about half a dozen years, and by the way, Henry Ford's newspaper was called the Dearborn Independent. Here's a shot of it. You can see his headline. It had a larger circulation than the New York Times. Now, if you compare, this was a weekly newspaper, so if you compare the circulation of Ford's newspaper to the circulation of the Sunday New York Times, Ford wins. This is the title of his series. It's called The International Jew, the World's Problem. And the argument of this series of articles is the same argument as in the protocols of the elders of Zion, which is that the Jews are conspiring to take over the world. This is what Henry Ford put in his newspaper week in and week out. And we know that people in Messina, New York, read this newspaper. And here's the final piece of this puzzle. This was the election, the presidential election of 1928. Now, mercifully, presidential elections then were short. They started on Labor Day and they ended on the first Tuesday of November. If only that were still true. If you think things are polarized now, they're nothing like they were in 1928. Why? Why do you think that these elections were so polarized? Al Smith was a Catholic, the first Catholic ever to be the nominee of a major American political party. The anti-Catholic invective of this campaign, it just is staggering. And I thought I had a strong stomach after studying some pretty unsavory periods in history. But there's everything from the Pope is going to move to the White House, and the Vatican will then set up shop in Washington and basically run the country, to all the stuff about priests and nuns having sex behind closed doors in their cloisters, and a conspiracy to end prohibition and bring the drunkenness that is associated with Catholics and Al Smith, the governor, as you know, of New York State. And so what you get in this election is the contrast between Herbert Hoover, who represents rural, traditional, Protestant, old, traditional America, and Al Smith, who represents the new, urban, immigrant, forward-looking, diverse America that is forming during this period. And this is one reason, key reason, why this election was so polarized. So you know that Al Smith was the governor of New York, and it turns out that his two main aides were Jews, and everybody knew it. And so this then, the passions aroused in this election reverberated, especially in New York State, and especially in upstate New York, where the hostility to Al Smith was really extreme. And so if you add all these different factors up, the immigration from parts of Europe where the blood libel was common, the immigration from Canada, from French-speaking Canada, where there had been ritual murder accusations, the revival of the Ku Klux Klan, the publication by Henry Ford of an explicitly anti-Semitic newspaper, and the presidential election of 1928 that had particularly powerful force in New York, because in this age before public opinion polling, everybody knew that if Al Smith didn't win New York State's 44 electoral votes, he had no chance of winning the presidency. And so it was a big deal. And so this is the environment that surrounded and this incident, and this is why I think you can explain how this accusation against Jews, unknown until this time, could have surfaced in 1928 in this place, Messina, New York. Now, it had a happy ending. Barbara stumbled out of the woods. I interviewed her 3 years ago. She was 91. Sadly, she passed away last summer. But spectacular person, no memories of this, but what she did have memories of is growing up all during her life, having everyone come up to her and say, "Oh, you're the little girl who started this whole thing." And she couldn't escape her connection to this, even though she had no memory of it. But she had, and this was great for me, she had kept an archive of all the press clippings that had surfaced about this over the years, and she let me photograph the whole thing. And so she gave me a good bit of her documentary base. And so when Barbara came back unharmed, and it was clear that nothing had happened, the first rumor that then circulated was the Jews let her go because they were afraid of getting caught. Then, though, Rabbi Stephen Wise and Louis Marshall then went on the warpath. And this then, they turned this incident into a national media event that lasted for almost 2 weeks. And of course, it was covered in the New York Times and the Washington Post, the Boston Globe, and so on, but it was covered in minuscule newspapers all over the country. Thanks to digitization, you're able to online find newspapers that were published in a little town in Texas or a little town in Montana, and all of these places covered this story. And they covered it in a way that ended up being quite favorable to American Jews. That is, the Jews had been wronged in this case. This sort of thing doesn't happen, it was said, in the United States, and it must never happen again. And this is the message that Louis Marshall and Rabbi Stephen Wise put forth. And so the good news is that this blood libel never recurred in the United States. The bad news is that it has not gone away. This is a Nazi newspaper from 1934, and you won't be surprised to know that this graphic imagery of blood from Christian children being collected in the vessels by these classic Nazi anti-Semitic images, this was part of Nazism. But the blood libel then has jumped over into the Muslim world, and you can go to any number of Iranian websites and find the allegation that Jews murder children. The leader of Hamas in 2014 said that the Jews are people who kill Christian and Muslim children. There was an accusation in Russia in 2005 that Jews had killed 5 young boys, and so on and so on. And maybe one of the really most surprising and shocking cases is this political cartoon that appeared in the Independent in London in 2003. And here you have Ariel Sharon shown eating a baby. And so immediately there was an eruption. What Dave Brown, the cartoonist, has done was to revive this old legend that Jews kill babies. Now, Dave Brown answered, said, no, this is actually a reference to this painting by Francisco Goya, Saturn devouring his son. You can obviously see the similarity between the two, but you still have to wonder why it was that this Goya image popped into the mind of the cartoonist Dave Brown. And so, where are we today? Is there a danger that these sorts of accusations could come back in the United States? And I don't want to be too pessimistic about this. I think the United States has been a place that has been much safer for Jews than essentially every other place in the world. But we do see some alarming things happening. And I think one reason why we see these alarming things is that there are now forms of media that can articulate and transmit and magnify anti-Semitic ideas and even calls to violent action. We have sadly seen violent actions in the last year or so, and these media now take place online. 4chan, 8chan, these things now get a lot of views every day, and what I think has one of the main things that has protected the United States and American Jews from these sorts of terrible attitudes is the lack of any forms of media that display these ideas. We may, I'm afraid, be moving into a period when these forms of media exist, and I think we should be vigilant for that reason. Thank you.